Welcome to another one of my Dr. Sadler's Honest Book Reviews. And the book that I am examining this time is The Porch and the Cross, Ancient Stoic Wisdom for Modern Christian Living by Kevin Vost. It's also coming out with Angelico Press. And as you can guess from the title, there's going to be a lot of comparison, connection, contrasting ancient Stoic philosophy and Christian thought and practices, both in terms of modern Christianity, but also in terms of early and medieval, particularly scholastic Christianity. So Vost is a longtime author. This is, one of his many books, and on the whole, I think it's quite good. I was glad that I was sent a copy. It's interesting to read. I will say that in my view, it's probably going to be for certain types of audiences. So those who are receptive to seeing some sort of connection between philosophy and Christian thought and practice. So those who think that, Christianity by itself or religion in general is complete bunk, it's probably not a book for you. Those who, on the other hand, think that, any tincture of philosophy destroys Christianity or faith, well, then this probably isn't for you at all, unless you're open-minded enough to read a work that is making a case for that. But I think for most people that are interested in Stoicism or in Christianity, there's going to be something in this work that you'll find worthwhile, something that will provoke some thought, maybe get you to read something else. So on the whole, my review is pretty positive. And now let's talk about specifics. I always like to begin by talking about the structure, style, and other elements of the works that I'm reviewing. So Vost is an established author. He writes quite well. I have, nothing to say negative about that. As a matter of fact, it's quite enjoyable to read him, and I think most readers will find that to be the case as well. He is writing not for academics, of course, but for ordinary people. I think he rather specializes in that, and he does that quite well. In terms of the structure of the book, he deliberately set it up so that it's focused around a set of chapters and a set of authors. So the authors that he's going to look at are four classic Stoic figures, the ones who we have the most writings from. Begins with Musonius Rufus, then he goes to Epictetus, and then he talks about Seneca, and then he brings it to a close by looking at Marcus Aurelius. So it makes perfect sense that he would look at these four authors. These are the ones that most people studying Stoicism are going to encounter before they might get into reading other authors who either are not themselves Stoic, but are telling us very important things about Stoicism, like Cicero or Galen or Plutarch, or reading other Stoic authors in fragments. So what we have here are these four big authors, and there's 3 chapters devoted to each of them. The first of which is a life chapter. So it's a short biography, and I do mean a short biography. Interesting stuff. Vost is, good at researching. You're not going to find anything in here where you're going to say, I don't think that's right. But these are pretty short. They're workmanlike. They're there to get across the tenor and you could say the context of the person's life. Where Vost is putting more attention and I would say more of a treatment of it are in the lessons chapters and then the legacies chapters. Now the lesson chapters, for the most part, are excerpted or summarized from the works of these authors. So he's doing exactly what he calls it. He's showing us what the lessons are that these four philosophers have to impart about daily life, about relationships, about freedom, about how we ought to think of ourselves, desires, aversions, all these sorts of things. And then he has an interesting legacy chapter. In each legacy chapter, talks in part about the connection between these Stoic authors and other sometimes Christian authors, or certainly Christian practices, doctrines, the way of life, and tries to connect them together. But he also does talk about other Stoic authors and even other authors in the mix that are quite interesting. It's a bit rather selective, but we'll get to that when we talk about the key themes. As far as you can tell that it's not a very long book. It's about 188 pages total. So it's a fairly quick read, I would say. Some of the chapters are as short as just a few pages. Some of them are a good bit longer. And, you probably could read it in sections, just read, say, the Musonius, or just read the Marcus as, shorter selections. Like if you were going to teach this, it could be useful for that, or if you had a book group. So that's the structure. The style, like I said, very readable. I think it's well argued, well researched. Quite interesting and good presentation of things here. All right, now let's talk about the key themes or the key ideas of this work. And so, as I mentioned, it really breaks down into four main sections. There is a very short author's preface where he tells us about why he was writing it, on the nature of this book, how you might use it, and then there is a sort of wrap up at the end, conclusion, bringing Stoic wisdom and Christian love into our world today, talking about the idea of spiritual exercises, which I think is quite important, and is a way in which Christianity and Stoicism can be compared, and in which I think arguably Stoicism has in fact influenced at least some Christian thinkers. Sometimes they knew it. Sometimes there's a Stoic legacy that they're just sort of inheriting. So let's talk about Musonius, the person who we have the least about. That's the first person that he discusses. He talks about his life. Then he goes on to summarize his lectures, and really some of the key themes in Vost's view are the duties and joys of family life. That's front and center. He dwells quite a bit on connections between Musonius's views on sexuality and marriage and how we ought to use our bodies, and similarities with Christian morality. He also talks about philosophy as training, which is right there. I mean, Musonius thinks that philosophy is primarily practical. There are some theoretical aspects to it, but those are subordinated to that. And then he also talks about Musonius's insistence, which is quite Stoic, goes all the way back to Zeno, on equality in our treatment of people according to gender. So, Musonius had stressed that women and men need to have the same kind of virtues. They both should study philosophy. And so Vost drives that home. And in the legacy part, he talks a bit about, Epictetus and, how this is going to fit in, because Musonius is, of course, Epictetus's teacher. And, you can see a lot of connections, like I said, between Musonius's views on ethics and Christian morality. Epictetus is given a much longer treatment, which makes perfect sense because we have more of Epictetus's works. So we know a lot more about his thought, and he has had a much greater impact, I would say, outside of just the sphere of Stoic philosophy, on philosophy in general. He endorses Long, who's a major Stoic scholar. Long's, statement that there's really four key themes in Epictetus: freedom, judgment, volition, and integrity. There's some good discussion of each of those there, although rather short. He also discusses Epictetus's It's not Epictetus's notion as such, because he is getting it from other Stoics, but we don't see it in any other Stoics that we have, of the three disciplines or topoi, desire and aversion, of course, choice and rejection, and assent or dissent, as Vost is putting it here. And he's got a proper treatment of that. He looks at a lot of the other key themes that we see arising in Epictetus, being in control or not in control. There's a nice discussion of proairesis, which is another key idea. I'm not sure that I would go with Vost on endorsing calling it the will, but he's getting that from Long, so that makes sense. A lot of discussion of death and duties, developing character. He's drawing primarily on the Enchiridion, which I think, again, in a book of this size makes sense. And then there's a long discussion of Epictetus's legacy, which, again, I think makes good sense, in part because if we look at all the people Epictetus has, in fact, influenced, ranging from Lipsius, the Neo-Stoic, to Admiral Stockdale, to cognitive behavior therapy and rational emotive behavior therapy, all this sort of stuff, it really does fit, and it helps to round that out. He also has a great discussion about how Epictetus himself was Christianized in his texts, and a little bit of snippets of what that looks like. Then we get to Seneca. And there's a variety of themes from the letters being discussed in the Seneca section. Let's see. I'll just read you a few of these. I'm not going to try to summarize all of them. How to read books wisely, how the philosopher deals with popular culture, needless fears, a sound mind and a sound body, philosophy is not spoken but lived, the stuff that you will find in Seneca's letters. And of course, Seneca wrote a lot, so Vost has to do a bit more summarizing here. And he discusses the fact that Seneca has two sides, two ways people viewed him. Because Seneca, in his biography, if we think about this, he was a rich man. He did have access to power. He doesn't appear to have been particularly effective in getting Nero to not be a bad guy. Some people view him as what Vost calls an opportunist politician. Others stress the other side of Seneca, being a lover of wisdom, trying the best that he can. And I think Vost does a good job in pointing out that, look, both of these could be true. There are a lot of connections between Seneca and the early church, and Vost highlights those, which I think is quite good. He also discusses other later receptions of Seneca's ideas. And there's more discussion here of a very interesting figure, Lipsius, who's a Renaissance Neo-Stoic, or Reformation, really. So that's worth looking into. And then we finish up with Marcus. I like the title for the first chapter, Gratitude 101. That's quite clever. I would say Vost is good at naming these things, giving them contemporary titles. And he talks about each of the 12 books of Aurelius's meditations, the work of a human being, the beauty of the universe, don't turn into a Caesar, throwing away the bitter pickle. These are all sort of common themes that you see in Marcus, and Vost gives you a good treatment of these. There's also an interesting discussion towards the end of the Marcus section of the, at that time, Stoicism Today organization. Now it's called Modern Stoicism, and the blog is still retaining the title Stoicism Today. So that's part of what he's discussing there. And then, as I mentioned, he closes the book with a few reflections on spiritual exercises in Stoicism and in Christian authors. So that is really, in a nutshell, what the book is going to tell you about. On the whole, I like this book quite a bit, and I think it could be very useful for a number of people. It does what it aims to do, and it doesn't try to do more than that, which is kind of a good thing in a book. As an author myself, I can tell you there's a temptation to always try to add more stuff in. There's a lot of good surveying of the available scholarship and literature. As I mentioned before, Vost knows what he's talking about. and he brings together a lot of threads. Another thing that I really do like about the book, so it's officially focusing on 4 Stoic thinkers, but you're going to get introduced to several others, Stoics and non-Stoics, and so there's a lot of good discussions of those, short, but they're sort of threads that you can pick up if you want to follow them out. Whether it's Cicero, who's not a Stoic but is helping us to understand the Stoics, or Lipsius, or Heracles. There's enough meat there that I think it helps the reader understand how these things come together. And I'll say another good thing too. There's no conflation of, well, this is one person saying this, so we can automatically read it in to somebody else, which is sometimes a problem with literature, combining the different Stoics. So it offers a lot of good starting points. There's interesting comparisons being made in terms of Stoicism and Christianity. It makes good sense because it is the Porch and the Cross, so it's about those two. And I would say that the book as a whole is well organized. It's well put together. As I mentioned, you could just read, those 3-chapter chunks independently of each other. I think they do gain as a whole, as a composition. So those are the things that I thought were good about the work. There wasn't a lot that I found particularly problematic in this work, where I thought that the reader might get actually misled, or there's no place where I think there's any misinformation being given. I will say something about 2 points. One is early on in the book, where Vost is discussing Stoicism, and in particular Zeno, and framing it in terms of being influenced by the lives and lessons of 2 earlier Greeks, Socrates himself and the founding father of the Cynics, Diogenes of Sinope. It's controversial whether Diogenes should be called the founder of the Cynics. There is some scholarly precedent for it, but I personally think Antisthenes really does deserve the title better, that there is a continuity there. So it probably, could be a little bit misleading, but it's not anything that's really bad. The issue is, though, that the Cynics are a Socratic school, and Zeno is not just influenced by Socrates, he's influenced by the Cynic Socrates, by the Platonic Socrates, by Xenophon's account of Socrates, and by the Megarians, because he studies with these 3 different philosophical schools, and he reads Xenophon. So I think that could have been a little bit better handled, but that's a pretty minor quibble. The other thing that I have to say has to do with history, and it has to do more with the transition from Stoicism to Christianity. I'd say that Vost is really good at talking about early Christians. He's great at talking about Thomas Aquinas and people following that, including Dante. I think that part of the story that does get left out in talking about how these texts get passed on is the monastic inheritance. He does talk about how the Christianized version of Epictetus's text, will have the anchorite instead of the philosopher, and that's good. But the treatment of here I marked it actually, Seneca, right? We know that Seneca was incredibly important, as was Cicero, for monastic writers. It's not just jump from the patristic age, which is the age of early Christianity, the first say 6-7 centuries, all the way into the scholastic age. And I kind of understand where that's probably coming from. So that's kind of a quibble on my part, and that's because I do work on monastic thinkers. But so I think that I'm not saying it's a detriment to the work. I'm just saying that it's something that's left out of the story. And I think what this comes down to really is this is a book which is, it's definitely not designed for scholars, although scholars can read it. It's designed for the ordinary person who doesn't have a lot of background in this material, who will come away knowing quite a bit more and will understand a lot of the connections between ancient Stoicism and Christianity, including modern Christianity. So a few quibbles, but not a lot negative to say about the work. All right, so my parting thoughts on this work. I'm actually a fan. I would recommend this to people. I enjoyed reading it. It's good, even as somebody who does a lot of work on Stoicism and on Christian thinkers. It's good for me to get reminders of things once in a while. And Vost does know his stuff, so I think it was good. I don't know that, like I mentioned, people who are really uninterested in religion or Christianity or who view philosophy as a threat to faith are going to get much out of the book. But that's not most people, I would suppose. So I think that this could actually be quite good for a lot of people. I could see, here's probably my biggest endorsement of it. I think this would be equally useful for people in small groups studying Stoicism as it would be for people in small groups studying Christianity. And that's kind of a hard balance to pull off. So on the whole, I give it a solid recommendation, and I'm very happy that I got to review this.